the event and the other. What can we infer from this analysis of death? Death becomes the limit of the subject's virility, the virility made possible by the hypostasis at the heart of anonymous being, and manifest in the phenomenon of the present, in the light. It is not just that there exist ventures impossible for the subject, that its powers are in some way finite. Death does not announce a reality against which nothing can be done, against which our power is insufficient. Realities exceeding our strength already arise in the world of light. What is important about the approach of death is that at a certain moment we are no longer able to be able. Nous ne pouvons plus pouvoir. It is exactly thus that the subject loses its very mastery as a subject. This end of mastery indicates that we have assumed existing in such a way that an event can happen to us that we no longer assume, not even in the way we assume events, because we are always immersed in the empirical world through vision. An event happens to us without our having absolutely anything a priori, without our being able to have the least project, as one says today. Death is the impossibility of having a project. This approach of death indicates that we are in relation with something that is absolutely other, something bearing alterity not as a provisional determination we can assimilate through enjoyment, but as something whose very existence is made of alterity. My solitude is thus not confirmed by death, but broken by it. Right away, this means that existence is pluralist. Here, the plural is not a multiplicity of existence. It appears in existing itself. A plurality insinuates itself into the very existing of the existent, which until this point was jealously assumed by the subject alone and manifest through suffering. In death, the existing of the existent is alienated. To be sure, the other, l'autre, that is announced does not possess this existing as the subject possesses it. Its hold over my existing is mysterious. It is not unknown but unknowable, refractory to all light, but this precisely indicates that the other is in no way another myself, participating with me in a common existence. The relationship with the other is not an idyllic and harmonious relationship of communion or a sympathy through which we put ourselves in the other's place. We recognize the other as resembling us, but exterior to us. The relationship with the other is a relationship with a mystery, and the other's entire being is constituted by its exteriority, or rather its alterity. For exteriority is a property of space and leads the subject back to itself through light. Consequently, only a being whose solitude has reached a crispation through suffering and in relation with death takes its place on a ground where the relationship with the other becomes possible. The relationship with the other will never be the feat of grasping a possibility. One would have to characterize it in terms that contrast strongly with the relationships that describe light. I think the erotic relationship furnishes us with a prototype of it. Eros, strong as death, will furnish us with the basis of an analysis of this relationship with mystery, provided it is set forth in terms entirely different from those of the Platonism that is a world of light. But it is possible to infer from this situation of death, where the subject no longer has any possibility of grasping, another characteristic of existence with the other. The future is what is in no way grasped. The exteriority of the future is totally different from spatial exteriority, precisely through the fact that the future is absolutely surprising. Anticipation of the future and projection of the future, sanctioned as essential to time by all theories from Bergson to Sartre, are but the present of the future and not the authentic future. The future is what is not grasped, what befalls us and lays hold of us. The other is the future. The very relationship with the other is the relationship with the future. It seems to me impossible to speak of time in a subject alone, or to speak of a purely personal duration. other and the other. I have just shown the possibility of an event in death, and I have contrasted this possibility, where the subject is no longer master of the event, with the possibility of the object, which the subject always masters and with which it is, in short, always alone. I have characterized this event as a mystery, precisely because it could not be anticipated, that is, grasped. It could not enter into a present, or it could enter into it as what does not enter it. But the death thus announced as other, as the alienation of my existence, is it still my death? If it opens a way out of solitude, does it not simply come to crush this solitude, to crush subjectivity itself? In death there is indeed an abyss between the event and the subject to whom it will happen. How can the event that cannot be grasped still happen to me? What can the other's relationship with a being, an existent, be? How can the existent exist as mortal and nonetheless persevere in its personality, preserve its conquest over the anonymous there is, its subject's mastery, the conquest of its subjectivity? How can a being enter into relation with the other without allowing its very self to be crushed by the other? This question must be posed first, because it is the very problem of the preservation of the ego in transcendence. If the escape from solitude is meant to be something other than the absorption of the ego in the term toward which it is projected, and if, on the other hand, the subject cannot assume death as it assumes an object, how can this reconciliation between the ego and death come about? How, too, can the ego assume death without meanwhile assuming it as a possibility? If in the face of death one is no longer able to be able, how can one still remain a self before the event it announces? The same problem is implied in a description faithful to the very phenomenon of death. The pathos of suffering does not consist solely in the impossibility of fleeing existing, of being backed up against it, but also in the terror of leaving this relationship of light whose transcendence death announces. Like Hamlet, we prefer this known existence to unknown existence. It is as though the adventure into which the existent has entered by hypostasis were its sole recourse, its sole refuge against what is intolerable in that adventure. In death there is Lucretius's temptation of nothingness and Pascal's desire for eternity. These are not two distinct attitudes. We want both to die and to be. The problem does not consist in rescuing an eternity from the jaws of death, but in allowing it to be welcomed, keeping for the ego, in the midst of an existence where an event happens to it, the freedom acquired by hypostasis. Such is the situation one can call the attempt to vanquish death, where at one time the event happens, and yet the subject, without welcoming it, as one welcomes a thing or object, faces up to the event. I have just described a dialectical situation. I am now going to show a concrete situation where this dialectic is accomplished. It is impossible for me to explain this method at length here. I have resorted to it again and again. One sees, in any event, that it is not phenomenological to the end. The relationship with the other, the face-to-face with the other, the encounter with a face that at once gives and conceals the other, is the situation in which an event happens to a subject who does not assume it, who is utterly unable in its regard, but where nonetheless, in a certain way, it is in front of the subject. The other assumed is the other. Time and the other. I hope to be able to show that the relationship with the other is as entirely different from what the existentialists propose as it is from what the Marxists propose. For the moment, I would like to at least indicate how time itself refers to this situation of the face-to-face with the other. The future that death gives, the future of the event, is not yet time. In order for this future, which is nobody's and which a human being cannot assume, to become an element of time, it must also enter into relationship with the present. What is the tie between two instants that have between them the whole interval, the whole abyss, that separates the present and death? This margin at once both insignificant and infinite, where there is always room enough for hope. It is certainly not a relationship of pure contiguity, which would transform time into space, but neither is it the élan of dynamism and duration, since for the present this power to be beyond itself and to encroach upon the future seems to me precisely excluded by the very mystery of death. Relationship with the future, the presence of the future in the present, seems all the time accomplished in the face-to-face with the other. The situation of the face-to-face would be the very accomplishment of time. The encroachment of the present on the future is not the feat of the subject alone, but the intersubjective relationship. The condition of time lies in the relationship between humans or in history.